Yo, what up, Tab family? It's your boy, Reverend Stu, and we are back with my big bro, PG.
What's up,
and
man?
we're excited just for the conversations we've been having. People have been engaging with them. People have been talking about them, been sharing. And honestly, man, for myself, man, I've learned a lot even with talking to you and have really enjoyed, man, our time just like being together, seriousness, laughing, all of those things. But this one is special. This one is special. Today, we're talking about your new book that's being released, PG's Preacher Playbook.
Yeah.
First of all, shout out to you, bro. I don't think people understand just how difficult writing is. You know, it's not something that's easy.
No.
It's not, in the scheme of writers and scheme of preachers, not a lot of people that use, language as a medium, but you use your brain, your preaching voice.
Yeah.
And now we're thinking about the pen. How does it feel?
Man, it feels good, man. It's great to be back again. Having these conversations, which I have been also getting the same feedback, how much people say they enjoy it. And so it's always dope to see people see you in a different space, light. So I really appreciate our conversations and those who have been helped so much with it. This is dope. This year is important to me. I'm celebrating 25 years of preaching. And so it takes me back to the moment. Now, I got to be honest, I've been bootlegging longer than that. I feel like I was called early at like around 8 or 9 years old. But I officially was licensed to preach in April of 2001. So here we are in April, getting ready to move into April 2006. So this makes 25 years. So as part of that, there's a few things that I'm kind of focusing on this year, more kind of flowing back. Every fifth Sunday this year, we're doing, kind of honoring those who've really kind of been impactful for me in preaching. So I'm looking forward to that. Typically that's our Impact Weekend, Impact Sunday. And I'm grateful for a church that's allowing me to kind of give honor to those who have really paved the way for me, from this first one where the pastor who licensed and ordained me will be sharing, and my Greensboro pastor. And then second, fifth Sunday will be some of my brothers in ministry I've come up with in preaching. On the third one will be who I consider a son and daughter in ministry and preaching. And then the last one, we're still working out that, but I'm looking forward to that. And so also I'm doing a ministerial boot camp to kind of pour back into that, and then bringing someone to do a sermon workbook piece. But the initial thing is this book that I've had an opportunity to kind of share and reflect, and it morphed because I was part of this compelling preaching cohort a few years ago, the inaugural one at Christian Theological Seminary with the acclaimed Dr. Frank Thomas. And part of the draw that I really went to it, because at the time I just finished my PhD and I was like, I don't want to do anything else. But one of my mentors, Dr. Peter Weir, says, Goodman, I think you need to be involved in this, because Dr. Thomas at the time was taking on to help us, the public. Dr. Thomas is probably one of our great griots when it comes to Black preaching, Black celebration in preaching, just whatever it comes to preaching. He was the first architect of the first PhD in African-American preaching and rhetoric. So I look forward to that, because I always want to, I've written before. I've written books on various things. And so even, my last one is complicated. That's been some years since I released it.
Yeah.
But I wanted to kind of write on something. I just got out my PhD of leadership, and I wanted to go on my other focus, which is preaching. So I really went into that cohort with the expectation that all of us were going to be in there to write our own work. And so I always had thoughts about doing a cookbook on preaching, which is like the prep of preaching. How do you kind of put that together? Or the playbook of preaching, which was going to be how you plan your preaching. I get questions all the time as someone who is a mentor, a doctoral teacher. People always ask me about that. So I was like, all right, either one of those ways I kind of do cookbook. How do you prepare? People always ask me, how do I prepare? How do you do various things that you're doing? And then the playbook, how do you plan your preaching? I get so many people to ask that. Well, as we got into it, the shift of the program kind of changed. And so instead of doing our own individual works, Dr. Thomas decided we should do a conglomerate, right? We come together, write articles, and then produce one big work. So it ended up having to shift to, I wrote an article on preaching to young adults. So I'm intrigued to see when that comes out. But I still had in my heart I wanted to do something on my own. And so what I end up doing is kind of figuring out how to combine the playbook, cookbook motif into something that I felt could be digestible to people in ministry.
Yeah.
And that's what kind of came up with this whole PG Preacher Playbook. So that's what you see. You see this book that I'm kind of getting ready to release. It's gone through different iterations because in order to make it applicable, I developed into a devotional. 40 days, which is biblically is always important. It's a season of testing and preparation. I combine certain elements, so it's not just about preaching and planning your preaching, but also how you prepare to preach. I do some other things because my also heart is leadership and stuff like that. And then I put some more personal aspects in there. It kind of opens up with a letter to my younger self who's starting in ministry. I wanted to make sure that I quoted some scholars. I want to have some gender balance. So there was a lot of things that this kind of work kind of took on for me. And I'm just kind of proud to be able to look back in retrospect of 25 years. And as one who continually works on the craft, who still has a passion for preaching, who is always constantly trying to evolve and grow. So that's really what kind of got us here to that point. So there was that aspect of it for me is what brought me to this thing. And to release it on the 25th anniversary of preaching for me is significant. It's meaningful. To make it here, is those who know my story and testimony, and that's incredible. So that in itself is a milestone. And so I'm really excited about it and see where it goes. And hopefully it's helpful and it's going to be a blessing to people who really take the study of Scripture, the communication of Scripture, the living of Scripture seriously. Right? Like I think that's really what I'm hoping it to become.
No, I think it will be as I've thought about even your books. You're starting off with purpose, and now you're getting to preaching. And it seems on some level that your books is also about your own personal journey. That the season that you find yourself in is almost an expansion. An embodiment of that own personal season. Which I think people are going to be helped by that because, preaching, I feel like preaching books ain't just about, the preacher in the pulpit. I think you make it very clear, in your introductory process about this is something for everyone, bro. I think when it comes to a person doing their own devotional, there are times where you're going to be doing your devotional, you're reading, maybe you need to ask yourself the question of what is the big idea, of this text? What is the relevant question? Where is the tension? And I love, where you talk about, on some level, the kind of, I don't want to say the sin and the grace, but the problems, in the text and the problems that we find ourselves in right now, and the grace, from that's in here and the grace that, you can live out, which I think, people are going to really benefit from. I want to think about you as a writer, when were the earliest memories for you of, not just using your voice, your young boy preacher, raising a holiness church, Pentecostal church, they'll give you a mic because you got an aura, you got an energy. And yet I wonder, were there moments in your early years where you picked up the pen to write?
Not really, which is, this development of writing has always come differently because I've always kind of been more of a thinker, brooder, if you will, than necessarily to one who articulates through the pen. I think it became more prevalent because as I've gotten older, I realized as Black people, especially Black preachers, we were not leaving enough for the world, right? We were leaving enough audibly, but we're not leaving enough when it comes to written work. And so even initially, my early writing periods was sermons I had preached that I really just was re-engaging, and instead of presenting them to the ear, I presented them to the eye. Because that's the difference when you're writing a book. It's not, I'm writing, most people, when I preach, I communicate to the ear. The book form has a different approach because I'm now presenting towards the I. And so that's really different. So even some of my earlier books were simply compilations of sermons. You know, that You Can't Run for Purpose was a series I did on Jonah. Road to Recovery was a series I did on Ruth. It's Complicated was a relationship series that I did, right? And but now this one is more, I didn't preach these. It's more kind of my thoughts, my process. So instead of me having to refigure something that was meant for the ear to the eye, this was strictly for the eye. So that just kind of made it, you know, a little more straightforward to the process. And I think also, honestly, D, I'm coming off of my PhD with that, which that was intense. You know, my whole dissertation, I think it's about 206 some pages of just writing and that kind of stuff. And so it was just different. The process was different. The other ones were sermons that I turned into a book. This one is kind of my life, my thought process, preparation, the evolution of someone who's been really working hard for 25 years to get this preaching thing right, and knowing I will never get it fully right, knowing that I'll die with sermons still in my heart, knowing that that at its core, I am trying to mine the inexhaustible truths of Scripture, that every day there's an evolution that always takes place in how one communicates and those kind of things. And it's also coming to the point where I'm not 21-year-old me anymore, 46-year-old me who can look at the same text at 21. Wow. My first sermon was Mark 5, the doctor's in. I'll never forget that sermon. And how one of the things I'm challenging myself is, how would I preach that now? You know, that's 25 years of experience, 25 years of history, 25 years of evolution, 25 years of heartbreak, 25 years of disappointments, 25 years of loss. You know, those things were different. And so it's always that. So, and be able to hopefully kind of, you know, express that. So, so that's kind of where I'm at on that.
Yeah. Word. Love that. So one of the things I remember you telling me about is, and I feel like you may have told the story to people before, and you've told the story again and again and again about, being in college and your relationship with Dr. Maya Angelou. Yeah. And as I've been flipping through your book and going to really like ingest it, you know, because even, you know, as I think about my life as a preacher, you know, it's like I was raised in Pentecostal church and Apostolic church, and then went off to evangelical church, and that's a certain type of way of preaching, you know, in the evangelical church. And then I transitioned back here, you know, to the black church, and like what I thought I knew about preaching, you know, when I got here and sitting under you, I realized that, like, you know, I've deepened as a preacher. I've become more confident as a preacher. I've become more comfortable as a preacher. And I would say very much like I've read a lot of preaching books, you know, from our favorite Fred Craddock, you know, that white with that red text preaching from Fred Craddock. That's a great one. Yeah. But it doesn't, you know, and even the 4 pages of a sermon. Yeah. There's another great
That's Lowry,
preacher.
Right?
I think so. Yeah. Another great preacher that, but there's nothing like, you know, like almost like the first century apprentice, where you're kind of thrown in the fire and you sit under the tutelage of someone, and, you know, you listen to them and you learn from them and you be challenged by them. And on some level, you try and like preach for their approval, you know, to like nod. So like a goal of mine one day, you know, as a little bro, it's like, man, one day I want to preach with him in the crowd, and I want to know what that feels like to preach with him in the crowd. As you were writing this book and thinking about preaching, and you think about your relationship to Dr. Maya Angelou, imagining her being in the crowd as you're writing in this devotional text, what do you think she would look at and be proud of in you as you kind of matriculated now over these years and wrote this one?
That's a great question. You know, I hadn't really thought about it until you really raised it. I don't think it was something that was on the forefront, but I will say it harkens back to my first encounter with Dr. Angelou on the campus of Wake Forest University, becoming her student assistant for our class. Now that you say it, I do think her impact on my preaching is through storytelling. I had never, up until that point, I can't say never. There was a guy, man, his name escapes me, who was an amazing storyteller for us in elementary school. His daughter and son actually went to school with me, Mr. Ferguson. And he used to come to elementary. He used to be a storyteller. He used to sing these songs, peanut butter, jelly, peanut. So he would and he would come in and do a story, and that was like the most amazing time. I've always been enamored with stories. So Dr. Angelo had a way of bringing you in with just her stories. I can't tell you, in our class, we had no book. She had a syllabus, but we ain't follow syllabus. Literally, our class time was us coming in there and sitting there in this room. And as she sat on a stool and just told story after story after story. And here I am years later, still can recount those moments. So I think what I would prayerfully hope that she would say is that I've tried my best to incorporate that into my preaching. I think if I'm known for anything, from what people tell me, I'm known for my illustrative storytelling.
Yes, absolutely.
That I have a way of making something live. And so I would think that hopefully, because, that's it, to the point where even when I try not to tell stories, it comes because it's organically.
It's just in you.
It's in me.
Yeah.
And I'm able to do that well. Now, so I would think that's it, because I've seen her just bring it in with just this story that would just, or whether she would talk about her and going over Ashford and Simpson's house, or with her dear friend, just stuff that I still recall. And I think even as Black people who are people of the book is literally a story, man. Like, we connect to stories.
Yes.
So I would think that if he was to do it, I think that's what she would probably say.
Yeah.
She would say, Mr. Goodman, because she always referenced you by your last name. That was something.
Yeah,
she was huge
big.
on. That was big on her.
You don't call her. You don't call her by her first name.
And
you
she
don't
wouldn't do that to you.
Yeah,
she would not do that to you. Mr. Goodman, and so how she was regal and royal in those moments. And I think that would be something that I garnered.
Yeah. I absolutely think that she would say the same thing. I think she would look at you and she would tell you that she's proud of you. I think she would look at you, and I do think she might actually call you by your first name.
No, that's not a style. That's not a style.
Nah, that's not
a style. It's not a style. Just,
yeah.
She was big on that, and I think when you know her history, you see why.
She was very, very big on respect.
Respect is huge.
Yeah. And even the importance of writing it down. I don't think people understand that. For Black people in this country, we do work in language. Language brings us together. It's the way we tell our history. Words matter. And having something, in writing outlives you. I'm sure there's going to be a point in time where all of us are forgotten. But, what we write, it will be passed down.
Yeah.
It is a deep gratitude to be able to do that. So proud of you, bro. Let me say that. In conclusion, you're talking about this about it's a preaching, but it's a niche book.
Yeah.
But I personally think that everyday people, can really, get something from your book. So in your own words, what could the everyday person who's not a preacher, who desires not to preach a sermon, don't even want to lead no Bible study. They don't want to, they just, they love to read.
Yeah.
They respect you. They're inspired by you. What would you tell that person? Why?
It's interesting. I'm glad you raised that, because I think I may be pigeonholing myself.
Yeah.
I believe it was a niche book, but I am encountering more people who just want to get deeper in the Word. And perhaps this work can help in that encounter. Maybe not to prepare a sermon, but just to give better tools to understand, to exegete, to dig deeper in the Word. I get more questions than I can't tell you. I know we're wrapping up. I get more questions about the Ethiopian Bible now, or people going down these rabbit holes with a lot of different things that I'm realizing a lot of the conversations is things that I thought for a season were embedded in seminary is now moving out into the wider world. And people are really asking these questions about, all right, this Bible, what's the difference in this translation versus, so I think it could be that. So I'm more evolving on that thought, that what I thought was more niche could potentially be a good part of the toolbox for people who say, you know what, I just want to have a greater understanding. And maybe this could be a pathway for that. So,
Indeed.
We'll see.
Indeed.
So
I'm sure it will be. Yeah, I'm sure it will be. So make sure y'all not only support and check out PG's other books, but make sure you pick up when as it comes out, as we go towards the launch. We want to make sure we support PG's Preacher Playbook. As when it comes to writing, supporting, showing love, it's very affirming. It signals not to just to us, but to others, that our words matter and that they should outlast us. And in this moment right now where, we are constantly like being erased or being diminished, we need to continue to affirm and appreciate the gift that God has given us in our pastor, in his words, and in his presence. So we're going to constantly keep this conversation going up. We're going to have particularly three more conversations exploring themes and ideas and principles in his book to get him, to get him and us in conversation with this playbook as we get closer to launch day. All right, my bro.
Sounds good.
We're so grateful for you and so grateful for each of you. We love y'all. Y'all take care. Be blessed.